The Adams County Coroner's Office stands behind the county maintenance yard outside Brighton, Colorado, a squat concrete building with no windows on the lower level and a single flag that is replaced more often than anyone notices. Most residents pass it daily without realizing what it is, which is exactly the point. Death does not need an audience. I have worked inside this building for 17 years, the last 5 as elected county coroner. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Brooks. I am board certified in anatomic and forensic pathology, and until recently, I believed experience insulated you from surprise. Before this job, I spent years in hospital pathology, reading frozen sections and performing autopsies on patients whose deaths followed documented illness. There was order in that work. Disease behaved predictably. Even tragedy respected physiology. Families were sad, but they understood. Forensic pathology strips that comfort away. We see people who die alone, suddenly, or violently, often without explanation. Suicides, overdoses, accidents, homicides, and quiet deaths that leave no witnesses. The body becomes the only reliable narrator, and your responsibility is to listen without emotion. Detachment is not optional in this profession. It is a survival skill. If you allow yourself to imagine the life that once occupied the body, you will miss what the tissue is telling you. Over time, you learn to focus on anatomy, not identity. I have performed or supervised more than 2,600 autopsies. I have seen bodies destroyed beyond recognition and others untouched except for the fact that they are no longer alive. I thought I understood the full range of human failure. I was wrong. The case that changed that belief arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 2024. 3 bodies were scheduled that day. 2 were routine. The third was a welfare check. Female, mid-30s, found deceased in her townhouse after co-workers reported she hadn't shown up for a week. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. Possible overdose or natural causes. My technician, Aaron Pike, had already prepared the suite when I arrived. Aaron had worked with me for 8 years and rarely commented on cases. That morning, he was unusually quiet. Her name was Emily Harlan. She was 35 years old and worked remotely as a compliance analyst for a financial firm. The responding officers described the scene as clean and undisturbed. When the transport bag was opened, nothing appeared remarkable. Mild decomposition consistent with 4 days post-mortem. No visible trauma. No blood. No ligature marks. Her clothing was ordinary. Her fingernails clean. Her posture relaxed in death. Everything about her suggested a case that would resolve itself within an hour. During the external examination, my hands moved automatically, documenting scars, tattoos, and identifying features. Near the lower left rib margin, I noticed a faint linear mark beneath the skin. Not a wound, not bruising. A subtle irregularity that caught the light differently. I palpated the area gently. The resistance beneath my fingers was firm and fixed, not organic in the way tissue should be. Aaron noticed my pause. "Old surgery?" he asked. I nodded, though the answer did not satisfy me. When I prepared for the initial incision, I reminded myself that unfamiliar findings usually have mundane explanations. Retained sutures. Scar tissue. Prior procedures patients forget to disclose. Rationality keeps this job manageable. But the moment my scalpel met resistance just beneath Emily Harlan's skin, I understood that whatever explanation waited beneath the surface was not going to be mundane. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach tighten, that this was not the first time something like this had passed through my hands. The Y incision is muscle memory after enough years. Shoulders to sternum, sternum to pubis. Clean, efficient, respectful. When my scalpel met resistance fully 2 inches into the first cut, I stopped immediately. Bone does not sit there. Neither does cartilage. I adjusted my angle and applied gentle pressure again. The blade snagged, as if caught on fishing line buried under the skin. That sensation does not belong in an autopsy suite. Aaron leaned closer without speaking, already reaching for the camera. I retracted the skin carefully, separating tissue layer by layer instead of continuing the cut. What emerged beneath the subcutaneous fat was filament. Clear, braided, threaded laterally across the abdominal wall in deliberate intervals. Not loose, not frayed, anchored. The knots were buried deep, placed to avoid irritation or tearing. This was not post-surgical debris. This was an intact structure. Aaron exhaled slowly. "That's not normal," he said. I agreed without looking away. As the incision widened, more of the pattern revealed itself. The filament traced a repeating geometry, looping through fascia with consistent spacing, never crossing randomly, never intersecting by accident. It avoided major vessels with surgical precision. Whoever placed it understood anatomy at a level that made improvisation impossible. This was planned, executed, maintained. My hands moved automatically, but my mind lagged behind, struggling to categorize what I was seeing within any known procedure. When the abdominal cavity was fully opened, the structure continued inward. The liver capsule had been penetrated without hemorrhage. The mesentery carried tension without ischemia. The bowel was untouched, as if intentionally preserved. Tissue response told the story clearly. Fibrosis, vascular incorporation, long-term healing. This had been inside her for months. Emily Harlan had lived, worked, slept, and breathed with this architecture integrated into her body. That realization fractured my detachment more than any violent injury ever had. The thoracic cavity showed variation rather than absence. The heart itself was not pierced, but its motion was subtly constrained by anchoring points along the pericardium. Enough to limit extreme exertion, not enough to cause symptoms. A mechanical governor built from flesh and filament. I had no medical term for it. Only the growing certainty that the goal had never been repair. It had been control. Cause of death was not apparent until neuropathologic examination. The brain appeared normal until I examined the brainstem. At the cervicomedullary junction, I found a pinpoint lesion, no more than 2 millimeters wide. Precise. Catastrophic. A tool had been inserted at exactly the location required to stop respiration instantly. No defensive injury. No prolonged distress. This was execution disguised as physiology. As we documented and closed, the implications settled heavily in my chest. Whatever had been done to Emily Harlan months earlier was not the fatal act. The fatal act was the final step. And no one builds something this precise, this restrained, and this survivable unless they intend to observe it over time. I did not sleep the night after Emily Harlan's autopsy. That was unusual for me. I am practiced at compartmentalization. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the filament pattern again, not as an image, but as a logic problem I could not solve. By morning, I knew what was bothering me most was not the discovery itself, but the familiarity of it. I had the distinct, sickening sense that I had encountered something adjacent to this before and failed to recognize it for what it was. I went into the office early and accessed our archive case database. Years of closed files scrolled past as I filtered for unexplained internal findings, vague notations, anything I might have dismissed under pressure. At first, nothing stood out. Then I found a case from 4 years earlier. Male, 41. Found deceased in a storage unit during winter. Cause of death, hypothermia with contributing alcohol intoxication. The file was thin, too thin. During that autopsy, I had documented unusual fibrous bands within the abdominal cavity and attributed them to prior surgery with poor healing. No surgical records were found, but the decedent had been transient. I had accepted the explanation because it fit the narrative. Now, looking at the photographs again, My stomach tightened. The bands were not scar tissue. They were filament. Clear. Braided. Anchored with the same spacing I had seen in Emily Harlan. I had missed it. Worse, I had rationalized it away. That man had died without ever being recognized as part of something larger. His body had passed through my hands as background noise, another statistic in a cold winter. The realization was not just professional failure. It was complicity through assumption. Whatever system had been operating then had already been refined enough to survive casual scrutiny. I notified the district attorney and state investigators immediately. The response was cautious, controlled. 1 anomalous case is curiosity. 2 suggests pattern. 3 demands resources. By the end of the week, we had identified 2 more historical cases with similar internal findings, all previously explained away under plausible but incomplete narratives. The common thread was not geography or profession. It was invisibility. Each of the victims had lived on the margins of notice. Temporary housing, remote work, few close contacts. People whose bodies could be altered without immediate detection and whose deaths would not trigger prolonged scrutiny. This was not random selection. It was risk management. As I closed the files and leaned back in my chair, a colder thought took hold. If I had dismissed this once, others had too. And if these were the cases that ended in death, then the living examples, the successful ones, were still out there, unexamined, carrying structures no one knew to look for. Once multiple cases were identified, the investigation shifted quietly from local concern to federal interest. No press releases were issued. No public warnings made. I was instructed to continue my duties as usual while forwarding any comparable findings through a restricted channel. Officially, my role was advisory. Unofficially, I had become a reference point for something no one wanted to name yet. Patterns demand interpretation, and interpretation creates responsibility. What disturbed me most was the variation. The filament structures were not identical between victims. Placement differed. Density changed. Some organs were spared in one body and constrained in another. This was not ritual repetition. It was iteration. Each design appeared adjusted for anatomy, body habitus, and prior medical history. Whoever engineered this was learning, refining, eliminating variables. That realization reframed every death as a data point rather than an endpoint. A case from Nebraska confirmed that suspicion. Female, 29, found deceased in a short-term rental. Initially ruled natural causes. Re-examination revealed partial filament placement along the thoracic wall. Incomplete. The heart showed mild stress, changes consistent with exertion. She had collapsed while exercising. The system had failed under strain. That failure appeared to be the reason she was terminated. I began overlaying autopsy photographs digitally, mapping filament placement against cause and timing of death. The correlation was unmistakable. Those with incomplete or destabilized structures were killed quickly and cleanly. Those with stable configurations survived longer. The filament was not decorative. It was evaluative. It measured tolerance. During a closed briefing, an analyst asked whether the structures could represent restraint or punishment. I rejected both explanations. Restraint restricts movement overtly. Punishment produces suffering. These systems did neither. They optimized compliance, reduced extremes, smoothed biological variance. The bodies were not being controlled. They were being standardized. The phrase physiological governance appeared in one internal memo. I disliked how accurate it felt. The human body reduced to acceptable parameters. Deviation corrected. Failure removed. Medicine repurposed into regulation. That night, for the first time in my career, I reviewed my own medical records not out of curiosity, but suspicion. The trust one once placed in procedure had eroded. Because patterns like this do not emerge accidentally. They are built. The first living subject entered the investigation by accident. A cardiologist in northern Illinois contacted federal authorities after noticing unexplained mechanical restriction during a routine stress echocardiogram. The patient was a 32-year-old woman with no cardiac history and excellent baseline fitness. Her heart rate rose appropriately, but stroke volume plateaued unnaturally. The imaging suggested limitation without pathology. Something was preventing full excursion. That anomaly triggered advanced imaging, and advanced imaging revealed the filament. I was consulted under non-disclosure agreements, so restrictive they bordered on absurd. When the scans appeared on my screen, I recognized the architecture immediately. The pattern was complete, balanced, integrated. There were no abrupt terminations, no stress points, no signs of tissue rejection. Unlike the deceased cases, this system had reached equilibrium. Whatever criteria governed success, this subject had met them. She described symptoms that were easy to dismiss: fatigue, vivid dreams of immobility, an intermittent sense of internal pressure she could not localize. No pain, no functional impairment significant enough to prompt medical concern. That absence was the most unsettling feature. The system was invisible by design. It did not announce itself. It functioned quietly within tolerance. Protective custody was arranged within 48 hours. Surveillance established. Communication limited. The ethical debate unfolded predictably. How much did she need to know? How much would knowing destabilize her condition? In the end, partial disclosure was chosen. Enough to justify monitoring. Not enough to explain her body to herself. I signed off on that decision and have regretted it every day since. 2 weeks later, she vanished. No forced entry. No struggle. Monitoring equipment disconnected carefully, without damage. Her personal effects remained untouched. There was no body. No termination. She had not been killed. She had been retrieved. That distinction altered the entire framework of the investigation. Death was no longer the inevitable outcome. It was a contingency. Successful subjects were assets, not liabilities. The filament systems were not experiments abandoned at failure. They were prototypes advanced to the next stage. For the first time, I understood that the dead were not the primary concern. They were evidence of rejection. The living, those whose bodies adapted correctly, were the goal, and they were no longer within our reach. After the retrieval, I requested administrative leave. Officially, it was exhaustion. Unofficially, it was fear. Fear that my objectivity had been compromised by proximity. I reviewed my own medical history obsessively. Every prior procedure, every scar, every imaging study I had ever undergone. Rationally, I knew I had not attended any optimization retreat or alternative clinic. But rationality had begun to feel like a fragile defense rather than a certainty. During my absence, the task force identified 2 additional deaths. Both involved incomplete filament systems. Both victims had survived several months before termination. The pattern was now undeniable. Subjects whose internal architectures destabilized under stress were removed quickly and cleanly. Failure was not punished. It was corrected by elimination. One briefing included language I had hoped never to hear in a medical context. A senior analyst described the deaths as necessary attrition. The phrase landed heavily in the room. Attrition implies expectation. Planning. Acceptable loss. I realized then that we were not dealing with criminals reacting to outcomes. We were observing operators executing a protocol. I began to suspect that the filament was not the final form. It was scaffolding, a transitional structure designed to condition the body towards something more stable. The deaths were not endpoints. They were discarded drafts. That realization reframed every ethical debate. Consent, harm, legality, those concepts mattered only temporarily. Systems like this do not ask whether they should exist. They ask whether they can persist. And persistence requires optimization, not mercy. When I returned to work, I added full-body imaging to select autopsies under the justification of quality assurance. Quietly, methodically, watching for symmetry, watching for intent. Each clean skin brought relief. Each ambiguous finding tightened my chest. I understood then that my role had shifted. I was no longer merely documenting death. I was cataloging failure, hoping to recognize success before it disappeared again. By early summer, the investigation no longer felt reactive. It felt anticipatory. We were not waiting for new cases so much as expecting them. Federal involvement increased, but visibility decreased. Briefings grew shorter. Information became compartmentalized. I noticed files I had once accessed freely were now restricted. The system, whatever it was, had advanced beyond the need for open consultation. My usefulness was narrowing to confirmation rather than interpretation. I was asked directly whether I believed the architects were physicians. I said no. Physicians work toward outcomes defined by care. This work showed no interest in recovery or benefit as medicine understands it. The thinking was closer to engineering: test, revise, discard, refine. Bodies were variables, not patients. That distinction explained the precision and the indifference equally well. A case from Wisconsin arrived without ceremony. Male, 37, sudden death during sleep. Initial findings were unremarkable. Imaging suggested subtle thoracic constraint. Dissection confirmed partial filament placement beneath the pectoral musculature. Incomplete. He had survived nearly a year. Whatever threshold governed acceptability, he had crossed it late. The common factor across all cases was not profession, location, or background. It was participation in loosely regulated wellness programs, longevity clinics, cognitive optimization centers, places where consent forms were aspirational and oversight minimal. The system did not need to abduct people. It only needed them to volunteer. One internal report described the process as adaptive physiological standardization. I found the phrase chilling in its neutrality. It stripped humanity from the equation entirely. The filament did not harm the body. It reshaped it, reduced extremes, smoothed variance, made outcomes predictable. At home, I avoided mirrors without understanding why. Seeing my own unaltered chest felt strangely provisional, as if I represented an outdated version of myself. My wife noticed my distance, but misattributed it to stress. I did not correct her. There are some realizations you cannot share without infecting others with them. I understood then that this system did not depend on secrecy. It depended on inevitability, on the assumption that progress, once framed as improvement, would not be questioned until it no longer resembled choice. The first confirmed retrieval failure occurred in mid-August. A protected subject in Oregon missed a scheduled biometric check-in. Surveillance footage showed her apartment intact, door locked from the inside, windows secured. When agents entered, they found the monitoring equipment powered down and neatly disconnected. No signs of struggle, no signs of haste. The absence itself was deliberate. She had not been taken by force. She had been collected according to plan. Her body was discovered 3 days later in a public park restroom. No trauma, no defensive injuries. The autopsy revealed a precise lesion at the cervicomedullary junction identical to prior terminations. But this time, something was different. Portions of the filament system had been removed prior to death. The excisions were clean, surgical, and intentional. The structure had been reclaimed. That detail changed the investigation permanently. The system was not merely implanted and observed. It was recoverable. The human host was a temporary platform, not the endpoint. Once sufficient data had been collected, the architecture itself became the asset. Death was simply the method of disengagement. I began to imagine storage facilities somewhere beyond our jurisdiction. controlled environments housing extracted systems suspended in preservation medium, completed configurations cataloged and compared, lessons learned without the inconvenience of living variables. The thought was speculative, but it fit the evidence too well to dismiss. During an emergency briefing, someone finally asked the question no one had wanted to voice. What happens when live subjects are no longer necessary? When the system has learned enough to be implemented without iteration? No one answered. Silence carried the implication. Shortly afterward, federal procurement flagged anomalous biomedical shipments routed through shell corporations. Contents classified. Destinations undisclosed. Oversight deferred. The investigation stalled not because of lack of evidence, but because authority dissolved into abstraction. I understood then that retrieval was not a corrective measure. It was a milestone, and milestones imply progression, not conclusion. In September, I was summoned to testify before a closed federal oversight panel. No press, no transcripts, no questions allowed outside prepared parameters. They asked whether the filament systems could be safely removed once integrated. I told them the truth. Removal would be catastrophic. The body had adapted around the structure. Vessels had rerouted. Load paths had shifted. The architecture was no longer foreign. It was functional. Extracting it would not restore the original body. It would destroy the modified one. One panel member asked whether voluntary implantation could be considered ethical under informed consent. I paused longer than protocol recommended. Ethics requires symmetry of understanding. Consent requires comprehension. No subject I had examined could possibly understand what was being done to them because the outcome was not defined. You cannot consent to becoming a prototype for an unknown standard. After that session, my access changed noticeably. Files I had reviewed freely became restricted. Briefings arrived late or incomplete. I was no longer being consulted for interpretation, only confirmation. The system had gathered sufficient data. It no longer needed dissent. Back in Adams County, I performed an autopsy on a teenager killed in a rollover accident. No filament, no structure, just trauma. I felt an unexpected relief that bordered on grief. The death was tragic, but comprehensible. Anatomy behaved as it should. Nothing had been optimized. That reaction frightened me more than any finding. I had begun classifying bodies by threat rather than loss, by anomaly rather than identity. The system had already altered the way I saw the dead. I reviewed my past reports and wondered how many anomalies I had normalized over the years. How many early iterations had been dismissed as surgical artifact or unusual scarring. Recognition, I realized, is always retrospective. The body does not argue. It sets precedent quietly. And precedent, once established, becomes permission. I still arrive at the Adams County Coroner's office before sunrise. I still review intake sheets, confirm identification, and speak to deputies who want certainty delivered in clean sentences. On paper, nothing about my job has changed. I determine cause and manner of death. I document injuries. I sign my name. But every time I stand over an unopened body, I know that what I am really deciding is how deeply I am willing to look. I no longer assume the absence of evidence means the absence of intent. I request imaging more often than protocol requires. I justify it as diligence, quality control, continuing education. No one has challenged me yet. Systems survive because they learn when to remain invisible. I am certain there are people walking around right now with completed internal architectures. Stable, functional, approved. They may never be retrieved. They may already represent the finished product. Their deaths, when they eventually occur, will likely appear natural. Efficient systems do not leave obvious signatures. Sometimes I imagine performing an autopsy on one of them decades from now. Elderly, no external trauma. Organs that look healthy until you know where to look. Filament integrated so completely it appears native. The temptation to stop, to let the body pass without disturbance, is stronger than I want to admit. That is the burden I carry now. Not whether I can continue doing this job, but whether I am willing to expose truths that others have already decided are inconvenient. Documentation is a form of resistance, but only if someone eventually reads it. The system does not announce itself as harm. It arrives framed as improvement, as optimization, as progress that feels voluntary until it no longer resembles choice. By the time refusal becomes necessary, the body has already adapted. Every time I make the first incision, I remind myself that my responsibility is not to preserve comfort, my own or anyone else's. It is to recognize what does not belong, even when removal is impossible. Especially then,